and they're not as
Oh, well.
treacherous.
You could write a poem
Can I
on
share?
that observation.
Is that short? It's,
Hey, how are you?
and,
Talk Eileen into the cup.
then the
Oh,
next
okay.
day, at 8,
Well, you guys were good last night, right?
it's like, you have hoagie, because it's all Italian now.
I'm a little chilly.
So I got my hoagie,
Otherwise very close.
took a chair, I always have a chair.
Must have dropped to the
My
breeze.
Very
hat,
When the sun went down.
Sun went down.
on the
It's
beach.
just
I
been
drove
chilly.
Good morning, how are you? It was all.
We have something,
And
we have,
when I
everybody
left,
has
it
a.
was, I closed the chapter.
Yeah, yeah, so that should be nice.
How long?
We'll be in the chat.
Only 2 and 3 years, December 30th.
Well, I was planting flowers, so I thought.
Good for you.
It's,
I
but
just
it's,
stay and.
you know, we had a good life.
Oh,
We don't even have a
It
minute.
was wonderful trip. I just,
Not yet, we've got a few minutes.
you're welcome, anytime you want a story, we can get over.
So everything's good?
Yes, everything's fine.
I'll go socially
Okay.
distance.
Hi.
I'm so happy to see you.
How much is the Thursday?
Yeah.
Yes, on Zoom, yes, for sure.
Hey, she's back. Oh, nice to see
It
you.
was wonderful.
So,
Good, hi.
Andy, how
I think I'm gonna sit across.
Trip was good, oh my God.
Oh,
good. I
Yeah.
closed a chapter in the book.
it was over, it was,
It was
like 2 months past.
I visited, I never had to go
But
back
they
to
said it
Lake
was okay to get it.
Oh, yeah. 6
Oh,
Oh, it's done.
how was your reunion?
It
Good job.
was.
Are you?
Shabbos,
Yeah,
Dr. Moon, how are you?
You didn't know anybody?
None of you.
Like, I can tell you could get them
Let's
all
put
at the
this, I
same
walked
time.
into a room,
I thought,
I was told what room to go to, and I walked
at
into
my
it
age, I don't wanna
and looked around.
test fate.
And I said,
Give me a little time to get over the line before I take the
and then all of a
other.
sudden I heard Jackie.
You're gonna be on television.
I've watched the stream.
I sat there last week, but I'm never sitting there again.
Oh,
Every
I'll
move
be
I,
extra careful.
every move I made was on the screen.
I may have seen you, I've been watching this class from Chicago.
That was funny.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for warning me.
Somebody said, oh yes, I had that bug juice, and I'm thinking to myself, what?
Where's the young
I
lady?
had that one.
What's that?
Where's the young lady?
That's
Yeah.
my next door
You
neighbor.
know, you know how it goes.
I didn't call her this,
So,
she usually calls the day before when I
But it
call her.
was
She didn't call and I didn't call her.
interesting, there were 2 women.
She might show up.
Once they told me.
Oh,
they
yeah.
didn't have to-
She's very, very talented, she's a painter and she writes
Oh,
books.
'cause they all.
My next door neighbor, I like she does.
See, we need young
So somebody
people.
came up to me and said, a guy,
Okay,
man.
I do.
How are you?
But I didn't want to cry, I didn't know.
I said, wait a minute, did you have it? They said, wait, I said, well, here's the hour.
Good.
Yeah.
Good, you sound good.
Well, that's.
Yeah, I was, it was nice. I didn't want to bother you.
I don't wanna be right in front of them and, you know what I mean?
Okay, this lady just.
Hi, Flo, how are you?
25.
You know, I know.
You got a big conference, so you. I guess I'm wrong.
That's funny.
Your face on the Sundays when it's just.
That's right,
Materials
that's right,
perfect.
I know.
It's too simple
I know.
for the amount of people.
I know.
And it's all
Yeah,
and
yeah, it works for me, I'm just wondering what to do, but until this is on Ken's own,
Otherwise,
I might as well. I'm traveling.
For that hot and safe, right, exactly.
my grandmother's house.
And, oh yeah, just do it.
just talking about where you're from. I grew up with Springfield, and then we moved away for 20 years.
So Jerry went to 60.
We've been a bit of a
Yeah.
Corvette.
Yeah.
And, you know, we raise our kids in Shaker, literally across the street, Fairmont, from where we were going to Wilson and Fairmont. She's our daughter, very large reaction. It's all in that area. Well, not,
Yeah.
green,
Also around John.
Well, it's also because we talked
oh,
about
it's,
it the last almost
it was
2 years.
just, you know, that's,
There aren't really groups of people like there normally are. That's where whatever's transmitted.
Synagogues in it, where we just get a tax credit.
We went to Lost.
We went to Boston once.
Yeah, I get the most of it.
Yeah.
we
Let's
should
wait.
do that, but we've been away for so long, we're in the,
So you know, I was thinking about
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the free, the Detroit Free Press, or the free.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't blame anybody for whatever.
I want to be with the green space.
We moved from Portland to Detroit, we've been in Detroit since 2000.
Oh.
2000.
Have you been to shopping?
And, oh, well, I work for the Jewish Federation in Detroit, so,
I don't know about that.
I don't think anybody else is sure what's.
well, with the Federation, and with my job, I was all over, you know, all three. I've been in
Right.
So there's a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost full.
I have no idea. That's fascinating. The whole thing is on the rebels, but most of the person is watching.
Well, that would be because they wanted to do it
I go to shopping.
new chapter.
Well, the county raised the value of our property with taxation purposes. Properties are going up. We'll never get back to where we were before that.
Unfortunately,
Yeah, right.
Put the scholar.
Yeah, well,
I have spoken there. Hi, Debbie.
Today we'll be in Sarasota.
Very good, thank you.
29.
We're putting up a lot of
Morning. Morning.
put up with.
Last night,
If I saw you,
I can't wait till the big bell.
I was going,
oh, yes. Morning, how are you?
Good back here, boy. How was the outdoors?
You know, they're both election, it's good. You know it better.
Yes.
Well,
Slowing down. The singers.
like two of the
and you know, but you can see it's running into his own.
Yeah.
I tend which is actually, and una futura lacrima is a great aria. Gotta change it on.
Yes, yes.
Particularly why I go outfit I just like taking a little. Maybe I'm not
We can always go to our site. What we're looking for is character development.
yes.
Yeah.
But the trip was good.
It's a lot of
I will. Whenever we can.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So glad to see you. I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late. I hope that you're all doing well. I've been enjoying Sukkot and Simchat Torah. We love the holidays, but I've always wondered, what was wrong with November for a couple of these holidays? I mean, they come one right after another. Of course, it's exhilarating, but yeah, I've always wondered about that. Okay. So I wanted to just announce, as I try to do when I can, when we've had somebody who has been a loyal, staunch Torah study person who has passed away. And some of you remember Renee Bradley, who died several days ago. And Renee used to sit back in that area there, and we will miss her. She was a vibrant force here. Let's just pause for a couple of seconds and remember Renee. Okay, our blessing for our Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, and welcome to those who are live streaming. It's always good to know that you are watching and participating, and I often hear from people who are live streaming with questions or concerns or comments, so it's good to know that we're all together. So what we are doing now is we're working on Immanuel Kant's 4 questions. As I pointed out, this little discussion of his occurs at the very, very end of the Critique of Pure Reason. And the 4 questions are divided into 2 parts, at least as I understand it. The first 3 questions and the 4th question. The first 3 are, what can I know? What ought I to do? For what can I hope? And then Kant says that these are the 3 components in structuring the 4th question. What does it mean to be human? To be human is to engage in the search for knowledge, the quest for right behavior, something about how can I close the gap between the real and the ideal? How can I move closer toward the things for which we hope? And if we take those 3 activities, human activities, into account, that will help us to better understand what it means to be human. So I've decided to deal with these things with the last question first. I was almost going to say backwards, but I don't know that I'm going to moving from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. But since the book of the Bible opens, the Tanakh opens with the question, not that it's overtly asked, what does it mean to be human? I thought we would start there. And we looked carefully at Genesis 1. We began to look carefully at Genesis 2. And we, of course, noticed that these two chapters are organized differently. They have a different mood to them. So what I want to do is I want to go back and just quickly review what we discovered in chapter 1. To look at chapter 2 again. We've spent some time with it. And then I want to look carefully at the essay by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, The Lonely Man of Faith, in which he takes on just this question and deals, I think in a brilliant way, with chapters 1 and chapter 2. And I think once we get a sense of what Soloveitchik is up to, we'll come to see really how quite magnificent these two chapters are. Or let me put it differently. I suppose we don't need anybody else to tell us how great they are. But Soloveitchik does draw out the depth and the scope of the meaning of these chapters. And raises the question of valid and problematic interpretation. Because Soloveitchik speculates on deeper, broader, more far-reaching implications. And that raises the question of just how far interpretation can go. We've faced this over and over again. My answer to the question is how far it can go is how far we allow it to go. What does the community finally come to feel about these interpretations? If I'm the only one in the room who feels that this interpretation is valid, that's a problem for my interpretation, because I think there's no objective measure for validity. I like this idea of what the community will come to feel over time. Vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. This kind of idea. But we'll look at Soloveitchik and come to see something quite exciting there. So we've been looking at these chapters through the prism of the question, what does it mean to be human? So when we looked at chapter 1, I raised the idea that we can understand what chapter 1 thinks about what it means to be human by looking at the very important idea of made in the image of God. And what does it mean to be made in the image of God? We can speculate. We talked about this in general. Does it mean what Maimonides thinks it means, that God reasons and we reason? Does it mean that somehow God evaluates and therefore we are evaluative individuals? Does it mean what Heschel thinks it means, that it's not one attribute of ours which makes us fundamentally human, but the very fact that we're human beings? And Heschel's has the advantage of not being elitist in any way. For Maimonides, the more you deploy your reason, the more human you are. I think for those who think that it's our moral sense, the more we act morally, the more human you are. Gradations of being human. Whereas Heschel wants to say that everybody is equally human and therefore equally dignified in some intrinsic sense. I suppose he would want to say that you can undermine that through bad behavior, but you have an attribute which was not given to one another by ourselves, nor can it be taken away. And what we did for the first chapter of Genesis is to take the idea of the image of God as containing all the things that we can say about God from chapter 1. Everything God does in the creative process can be taken as a mirror of what human beings are and can be. That was my premise for understanding the anthropology, the doctrine of what it means to be human from Genesis 1. Okay? And we looked at some length about it. Let me just quickly summarize that, what we discovered. Let's see if there are any questions or concerns about it. I don't want to spend too much more time on it, but I don't want to pass over problematic aspects if they are. And then we'll look the same way at chapter 2 a little more extensively. So here's what God does in chapter 1. And therefore, just to repeat, what we are being made in the image of God. God speaks and speaks creatively. The word is creative. God evaluates. God saw that it was good. God puts things into categories, which according to Aristotle is a way to understand what we know. The more things you have in their proper category, the more you know. And Aristotle makes the point somewhere that if we can put everything in its proper category, we have supreme and total knowledge. God categorizes. God names. And of course we'll see in chapter 2, and we did last week, that there is such a thing as a proper name for things and an improper name. Maybe that takes it too far. We'll go back over that. One way of understanding chapter 1 is that God did not create matter. God did not create the world from nothing. The first sentence has been traditionally translated, "In the beginning God created," which suggests that God creates both matter and form. But the grammar certainly permits, maybe even mandates, the translation, "when God began to create the heavens and the earth being unformed and void." That is, those are the initial conditions. There is matter, there is chaos, there is water. And so God's creative activity is not creating matter, but shaping matter, giving form to matter. Of course, that relates to human activity. If God can be unqualifiedly referred to as the creator of matter, that we do not imitate. But if God is shaping matter, then that is something we can be made in the image of God about. God allows the laws of generativity to work on their own. God puts the trees with their seeds in it as the creation of plants. And therefore, there's the implication that there are laws of nature, laws of generation and regeneration, which are implicit in the natural order. And one of the things that human beings can do is, therefore, come to understand those laws. That is not stated in Genesis chapter 1, but that may be an implication. Leo Strauss, I mention Strauss fairly often, political philosopher at the University of Chicago, and he was also at St. John's, I think, at the end of his life, says the Bible does not have the idea of nature. Nature as an independent entity. Aristotle certainly has the idea of an eternal, independent nature. If God is eternal, nature is as well. And Maimonides makes the point that if nature is an independent entity, then God cannot very easily have God's way with it. And therefore that God controls nature and can manipulate nature, letting the sun stand still for Joshua, is presupposed by the non-independence of nature. But I'm arguing here, and I don't think any of Leo Strauss's descendants are in the environment, that Strauss got that particular thing wrong. God also blesses, And blessing in this regard promotes increase. Be fruitful. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Okay. So human beings, now, by implication, you can see that this argument is based on a premise. But assuming that premise, we now have a strong and really diversified sense of what it means to be human from Genesis chapter 1. And human beings are explicitly given the role of ruling. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Okay? Also, now not playing so much with the idea of imitation, but what independent attributes human beings have. Male and female are created simultaneously in chapter 1. Male and female created he, them. So human beings, and Soloveitchik's going to make a big deal out of this, in chapter 1 are born with another. They are never lonely. So, human beings are given the role of ruling. Male and female are created together. And God limits the cuisine of initial human beings. Does not give them meat to eat, but only plants. So their cuisine is the same as the cuisine of the animals. God does give meat to human beings to eat after the Noah story. I think for an interesting reason. Okay, so let's look at chapter 2. Gary?
So I take from what you said that this chapter is consistent with the idea of the Big Bang Theory having taken place, creating matter, as well as the laws of nature having been placed before God began to, I hate to use this word, manipulate them or utilize them. Would you agree with that?
Well, look, I mean, if, let's just think in terms of the timeline. If the creation of matter is at time t sub 0, what I'm suggesting about chapter 1 is that God enters the picture at time t sub 1, not at sub 0. God doesn't create everything. If that's true, then that's right. It makes room for the Big Bang Theory, for nature working on its own in some way. And this raises the larger question of the connection between science and religion. And what you're suggesting by way of implication is that there is some compatibility there, that they aren't necessarily, or maybe at all, antagonists. Jim?
But that, doesn't that imply a problem here, and that is, if God shapes the earth and the water and all that there was something already here, which I think unfortunately, or whatever, not unfortunately, but it implies that there was something else in charge before God got involved.
Yeah.
Because nobody will ever figure out how it all started.
Yeah.
We're not capable of figuring it out.
Yeah. Why does it have to be somebody else and not nature itself that
Well,
has
that's fine, but then that puts nature at least, if not a superior level, but certainly at the same level.
prior level?
And I think that's somewhat problematic.
Right. And I think that's why people like Strauss, by looking at other activities of God controlling nature, right, splitting the Red Sea, the sun standing still, manna, and so on, want to infer from that God is supreme over nature. I'm suggesting Genesis 1 allows, maybe even more than allows, a different view, and here is the solution to that problem. It's sort of a dodge, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Bible is not a philosophical text. It's not striving for utter consistency. The Bible tells stories, and we know that stories, even biographies, autobiographies, are filled with contradiction, right? What is it Walt Whitman says? I contradict myself, so I contradict myself. I think that's a good answer to the question, because an attempt to reconcile those two things would presuppose that one of the things the Bible is after, or should be responsible for, is utter consistency. And that would be an assumption that comes from the realm of reason as the highest category, and why should we assume that? So I think the Bible is bombarding reality, I might say, with different rays of light to uncover different features of the universe. And therefore, if I'm right about Genesis 1, it's got a contradiction. It's got a contradiction. I don't want to spend too much time on this, Bill.
Oh, okay. I mean, I sit here saying that you're presupposing, or that type of conversation presupposes science over the concept that I think the ancients had when they wrote this, of the concept of nothingness. Science doesn't permit us to have nothingness. I think the ancients, in writing this, there was a concept of nothingness.
Okay.
That which we don't understand,
Yeah.
and it comes before. It doesn't come before, it just, there is no explanation for it in their mind. We give them an explanation, a scientific explanation, which I think changes it from a story to trying to make it a scientific
Well,
process.
that's an interesting point. If you're right about that, then this is a critique of my view.
I checked up above, I'm right.
You checked and you're right, yeah. Who did you check with?
I heard a voice.
Look, there is the rabbinic notion of yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. So to that degree, at least, you're right. You just wonder whether or not that is a philosophical principle imposed on texts, or whether it actually emerges from the text. You know, it's interesting. One of Plato's late dialogues, the Sophist, is interested in non-being. I've tried to read that dialogue. Okay, Vivian,
Back to your.
take your mask down for a second, would you please?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Back to the story.
Mhm.
Also depending on the reader here. I'm looking at this, I know as many times as I've looked at this Genesis,
Yeah.
I'm seeing something different suddenly. When God says, "Let there be light,"
Yes.
and then all that follows, he is creating, let there be life. The earth comes to life before man is here. And it is doing its thing. And it is, I just see that as not hierarchy, but an interconnectivity of all that is alive as long as the earth is alive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, although what do you do with be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it?
Well, that's a problem to me. Subdue it. What are all the translations? Dominate it, live with it, build it, take care of it.
You know, the
Where
word...
Are we gardeners or are we
Right.
builders?
That word kibush comes from which we get kibush, is the same word that applies to the conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the people. So it has at least the connotation of dominance.
Right.
And we're going to see what Soloveitchik makes of it. Yeah, right. Hold on to that thought. I think, frankly, it applies a little better to Genesis 2 than Genesis 1.
Yeah.
Genesis 1 is very hierarchical.
Yes.
Genesis 2 much less so. I think the universe of Genesis 2 is more organic.
Right. Well, you begin in paradise, so there,
And earthling.
Right.
Human beings are earthlings in Genesis 2 and not in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
Just made by divine announcement and in the image, which seems to be this sort of thing rather than grounded.
God is building a ladder, but it's all connected. It's not. It's not in categories. There was nothing, it was, that's.
Yeah. Right, it's connected in the sense that the items of an outline are connected. I don't know that it's connected organically. Well, let's think about it. Earth.
Germane to what we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yes?
About a decade ago, a brilliant physicist who used to be in Cleveland here, Lawrence Krauss,
Right.
published a book entitled A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing.
Yeah.
And he brings together physics, cosmology, and religion.
Good, great, yeah. No, Larry Krauss spoke here on a
Did he?
couple of occasions, yeah.
Am
No,
I
very,
right? Is he brilliant?
I'm sorry?
Is he brilliant?
I guess so. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, well, certainly important. Okay, so let's go to chapter 2 now. Which, as we pointed out, chapter 2, verse 4, in our text, in the Jewish Publication Society text, the verse 4 is divided, separated by space. And that leads scholars, no. The space is now a result of a scholarly sense that the second creation story begins in chapter 2, verse 4b, the second half of verse 4. And the grammatical form, B'yom Asot Adonai, is exactly the same as Bereshit Bara. That is another thing that leads scholars to believe we've got a second story here, aside from all the differences in the story. Okay, so when the Lord made earth and heaven, when no shrub, no grass, and so on, same kind of structure, a parenthetical phrase. Verse 6, but a flow would well up. Verse 7, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. Okay? So a second kind of creation of human beings. Notice that the chapter focuses immediately on human beings and doesn't make human beings the acme of creation, the summit of creation, or at least the penultimate step, if Shabbat is the ultimate step. Here, in the language that I use, the focus narrows right away to human beings. Formed man from the dust of the earth, blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the man whom he had formed. And from the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree and so on. Well, let me not say so on there. Verse 9, and from the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight, good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Okay, 3 kinds of trees. The last 2 having only one instance, right? Lots of trees for food, 1 tree of life, and 1 tree of knowledge. And then we have this business about the different rivers, verses 10 through 14, verse 15. The Lord God took man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. Okay? Another vocation. The vocation of human beings in chapter 1 is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Human beings over the created universe. Here, human beings are intimate with the earth and charged to till it and to tend it. In the Hebrew, la'avda u'lashamra, to work it and to preserve it, to guard it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you will die. Okay? So here we have a commandment And the first no, N-O, in the Bible, there's no privation, there's no limitation, there's no negativity imposed on human beings in Genesis 1. So Genesis 1 in terms of human beings is all yes, do this. All permission. Genesis 2 introduces the no. There are limits and there are restrictions. And those, of course, to say no, to be responsible for not doing suggests a lot of things. Free will, the capacity to understand and to know, and so on. So implicit in that negative commandment are some other things about human nature. And you have a choice. Choice enters, I take it, I suppose it enters chapter 1, 2, because human beings could say, no, I'm not going to do what you said I should do. But in chapter 2, there's a consequence to misbehavior. And that consequence is ambiguous. And the serpent plays with the ambiguity. You shall die. If option 1, you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 2:02, you're dead. You eat it and you die. Or you eat it at 2 o'clock. You don't die at 2:02, but you become subject to death. You are now mortal. I take it this suggests that the initial conditions of human beings is immortality. And they can sustain that by eating from the tree of life. See, I've got a problem with what I just said myself. Immortality, I suppose immortality is a potentiality. Potentially you're immortal, and you secure it by eating from the tree of life. I'm not happy with that one either. What's that?
Tree of life or tree of knowledge?
There's a tree of life and the tree of knowledge. If you eat from the tree of knowledge, you can't eat from the tree of life. You are now subject to death. That's why they're banished. If you don't eat from the tree of knowledge, but recognize the tree of life, they have the opportunity to eat from the tree of life and to remain immortal. Or to be immortal. I'm not sure whether it's remain or be. But as for the tree, you shall die. Okay? And the serpent plays with that. The Lord God said it is not good for man to be alone. Okay? Notice the difference between chapter 1 and chapter 2. In chapter 1, human beings are never alone. In chapter 1, it becomes an issue. I will make a fitting helper for him. And the Lord God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and the birds of the sky and so on, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that would be its name. And the man gave the names to all the cattle and the birds in the sky and all the wild beasts, but for Adam no fitting helper was found. Now, what I made out of this last week is that this means that Adam has the capacity of discerning essence. And that the name, there's a theory of names here, that names are not just labels, tags, they connote. Okay? If a person is 5'1" and called Shorty, Shorty is not just the label. Shorty is an attempt to characterize who this person is. Okay? My inference is, and this is all inference, is that since Adam is regarded here as not finding a fitting helper, that Adam knows through the names of the animals that they cannot be fitting helpers for him. He will recognize himself as an ish, The birds are ophot, an oaf, ish oaf. Names are different. Therefore, this is the theory of names. Essences are different. Adam discerns by giving the animals their proper name. Does Roger have anything to do with who I am? No, it's a tag. It denotes, it doesn't connote. And my inference here, you can see it's something of a leap, is that Adam has the power of discernment so that he can see what a bird is and what a human being is. And therefore, through those names, to recognize that he hasn't yet found a fitting helper. Let's go on with it. I think there's a little more evidence for this idea. So the Lord God, verse 21, cast a deep sleep upon the man. While he slept, he took one of his ribs, closed up the flesh at the spot, and the Lord God, fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman and brought her to the man. And here's what the man says. This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, Isha, for from man, Ish, she was taken. So that, at least in terms of sound, Ish and Isha are similar. They're tightly connected. And from the similarity of names which Adam articulates, he recognizes that she is a helpmeet for him. Of course, she was also taken from his bones. Bone of my bones, okay? So Adam comes to have the power of discernment. We might say that Adam has the power of looking more deeply into the nature of things. That surface knowledge is something Adam here goes beyond. Okay? So, verse 24. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so they become one flesh. So chapter 3 now moves the story along, and I don't want to deal with that quite yet. What I'd like to do is to now take a look at the Soloveitchik article to see what he does with this. And this is an article, The Lonely Man of Faith, published in the journal Tradition in 1965. And it's long. It's starts on page 5 and ends on page 67. So this is a massive exploration of what it means to be human. Okay? So I'm just going to excerpt from here, obviously. So, first of all, he begins by talking about himself. All right, so now, we all know, he says, that the Bible offers two accounts of the creation of man. I'm just going to read it as it comes here. I suppose we'd say a human being or what. All right, so you'll allow me just to read what Soloveitchik is writing. We all know that the Bible offers two accounts of the creation of man. We are also aware of the theory suggested by Bible critics attributing the two accounts to two different traditions and sources. Of course, since we, himself, do unreservedly accept the unity and integrity of the Scriptures and their divine character, we reject this hypothesis, which is based, like many other biblical-critical theories, on literary categories invented by modern man, ignoring completely the, and now he uses fancy language, eidetic, noetic, ideas, knowledge, content of the biblical story. It is, of course, true. So he rejects the literary, historical assumptions that it developed through history by different sources, different times, over and against different problems. Then he goes on to say, it is of course true that the two accounts of the creation of man differ considerably. This is where he accepts the higher critical theory. He sees that these are two different stories. This incongruity was not discovered by the Bible critics. Our sages of old were aware of it. Then he quotes the Talmud, he quotes Nachmanides, he quotes Judah Halevi. However, the answer lies not in an alleged dual tradition, but in dual man. Not in an imaginary contradiction between two versions, but in a real contradiction in the nature of man. The two accounts deal with two Adams. Now Adam becomes a kind of type Adam. Two men, two fathers of mankind, two types, two representatives of humanity, and it is no wonder that they're not identical. Okay? I want to point out, he says, 4 major discrepancies between these two accounts. In the story of the creation of Adam 1, Adam the first, Adam Rishon, it is told that the latter was created in the image of God, while nothing is said about how his body was formed. In the account of the creation of Adam 2, you see now Adam 1, Adam 2, as types, it is stated that he was fashioned from the dust of the ground, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Second contradiction, discrepancy. Adam the first received the mandate from the Almighty to fill the earth and subdue it. Adam too was charged with the duty to cultivate the garden and to keep it. 3. In the story of Adam 1, both male and female were created concurrently, while Adam the second emerged alone, with Eve appearing subsequently as his helpmate and complement. 4. Finally, and this is a discrepancy of which biblical criticism has made so much, while in the first account only the name of God Elohim occurs, whereas in the second, Elohim is used in conjunction with the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, Adonai. So, it's God in chapter 1. It's the Lord God in chapter 2. 2 different ways of calling upon God, 2 different stories, and so on. So, let us portray these 2 men, Adam the first and Adam the second, in typological categories, categories of types of people. There is no doubt that the term image of God in the first account refers to man's inner charismatic endowment, right? As a creative being. That's our charisma. We're creators. We can go out into the world and shape it and create it and create in it. Man's likeness to God expresses itself in man's striving and ability to be a creator. Adam the first, who was fashioned in the image of God, was blessed with great drive for creative activity and immeasurable resources for the realization of this goal. The world, the earth. The most outstanding of which resource is the intelligence, the human mind, capable of confronting the outside world and inquiring into its complex workings. I used the example last week of Newton's law of universal gravitation. A couple of variables and a constant, and you have described from the human mind alone the connection among natural bodies light years away. The power of the human mind to, in a way, capture the nature of reality. In spite of the boundless divine generosity providing man with many intellectual capacities and interpretive perspectives in his approach to reality, God, in imparting the blessing to Adam the first and giving him the mandate to subdue nature, what's that? Technology. Directed Adam's attention to the functional and practical aspects of his intellect through which man is able to gain control of nature. What is Adam the first out to achieve? What is the objective toward which he incessantly drives himself with enormous speed? Now, you might say that's taking interpretation a little too far. So this is the question of interpretation. Is all of this implied in this notion of Adam the first, or is Soloveitchik now speculating out of his own mind? Nevertheless, even if it's the latter, it's a very interesting reading of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 on the assumption that the Bible's anthropology, the Bible's view of what it means to be human, is contained there. The objective is what is Adam out to achieve? The objective, it is self-evident, can be only one, namely that which God put up before him, to be man, to be himself. This is a affirmation out of the Bible of science. The Bible has given us the mandate to be ourselves. And therefore, when we use our minds to explore the nature of things, and then develop technology from our scientific discoveries to subdue the earth, to dam up the rivers, to put factories next to rivers, this is not a violation. This is what we were called to do. By whom? By God. How do we know that? It's in the Bible. Now, lurking in the background of what I've just said is Genesis 2, which we need in order to complete the picture of who we are. But the first thing to say is we are at least scientific, technological individuals who have a right, not only a right, a duty to subdue nature, to turn nature into resources for our own lives and betterment. This is what Soloveitchik is driving at here. Science and religion. Adam the first wants to be human. This is what being human is. It's not a violation of our humanity. It's what humanity is. To discover his identity, which is bound up with his humanity. How does Adam find himself? Where do I go to find myself? He works with a simple equation introduced by the psalmist, Psalm 8, which we looked at, who proclaimed the singularity and unique station of man in nature. For thou hast made him little lower than the angels, and has crowned him with glory and honor. In parentheses, dignity, gravitas, weightiness. In other words, dignity was equated by the psalmist with man's capability of dominating his environment. and exercising control over it. Man acquires dignity through glory, through his majestic posture vis-a-vis his environment. Hence, Adam the first is aggressive, bold, and victory-minded. His motto is success, triumph over the cosmic forces. He engages in creative work, trying to imitate his master. The modern scientist does not try to explain nature. I don't know, maybe this is wrong, but he only duplicates it. In his full resplendent glory as a creative agent of God, he constructs his own world and, in mysterious fashion, succeeds in controlling his environment through manipulating his own mathematical constructs and creations. Newton's formula for universal gravitation, which I think Salvation want to say, is a mirror of nature in mathematical language. That's what the scientist does. Tries to find ways to mirror nature in ways that can be manipulated. Adam the second, chapter 2. Adam the second, like Adam the first, is also intrigued by the cosmos. Intellectual curiosity drives them both to confront courageously the mysterium magnum of being, the great mystery of being. However, while the cosmos provokes Adam the first to quest for power and control, thus making him ask the functional how question, how does it work? Adam the second responds to the call of the cosmos by engaging in a different kind of cognitive gesture, different way of knowing. He asks, what is the purpose of all of this? What is the message that is embedded in organic and inorganic matter? And what does the great challenge reaching me from beyond the fringes of the universe as well as from the depths of my tormented soul mean? Adam 2 is tormented. Adam 1 is never tormented. Adam the second keeps on wondering, who is he who trails me steadily, right? God says to Adam, where are you? God says to Adam, don't do this. God punishes them. God hears them talking. God is trailing them. Is God trailing Adam the first? No. Go to college, learn all the stuff you can, and control nature. Gesundheit, it's up to you. Adam the second has a much more intimate connection to God. Salvation will talk about this. The biblical metaphor referring to God breathing life into Adam alludes to the actual preoccupation of the latter with God, right? If we're touched by a person, that person has some effect on us. We've been touched by some. God doesn't touch Adam 1. He just says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. God touches Adam 2. We've got the breath of God in us. Who is likely to be, in the conventional sense, more religious? Adam 2. Who's had an experience, a personal experience with God. Of course, when I say in the conventional sense, it's quite clear, isn't it? This is a big point, I think, that Adam 1 is also a religious person in fulfilling what God charged him to do. That doesn't mean all scientists, now we have to say all scientists are religious. No. But the mandate of science is, from the Bible's point of view, divinely supportive. The biblical metaphor referring to God breathing life into Adam alludes to the actual preoccupation with God, to his genuine living experience of God, rather than to some divine potential or endowment in Adam symbolized by the image of God. Adam the second lives in close union with God. His existential I, letter I, experience is interwoven in the awareness of communing with the great self, whose footprints he discovers along the many tortuous paths of creation. It's a very different sensibility here, isn't it? Who feels the power and the presence of God, who he can't escape because God's breath is in us. Both Adams, this is so crucial, I think, both Adams want to be human. This is not Adam the first is human and Adam the second. Adam first is not religious, Adam the second. They're both after the same thing in different ways. Both Adams want to be human. Both strive to be themselves. When a person opens Newton's Principia Mathematica and tries to read it and understand it, he or she is being human and fulfilling the mandate of God to learn, learn, learn. When Adam too goes to services and bows at the Baruch Hu and the Amida, he is being human and mandated by God to pay attention to the breath of God within him. Each is fully human. Or is it each is human in a different way? That's the question of tension. Are they reconcilable? The two Adams do not concur in their interpretation of the objective to be human. The idea of humanity, the great challenge summoning man to action and movement is, now here's the point, so I was wrong. He says incommensurable perspectives. You can't integrate them. I'm going to read this sentence now, ending with incommensurate perspectives. The two Adams do not concur in their interpretation of this objective to be human. The idea of humanity, the great challenge summoning man to action and movement, is placed by them in two incommensurate perspectives. So, let me ask you this question. Maybe we should stop and talk a little bit. Here are two possibilities that Soloveitchik's reading of the first two chapters of Genesis mean one of two things. We have different impulses within each of us. We have different kinds of vocation. We have different ways of understanding the universe. But ultimately, they're harmonious. Option one. Or let me put it this way. I can be a whole, satisfied, content human being by being both Adam 1 and Adam 2. The second option is, since they're so different, but they both are mandates of how to be human, human life can never be harmonious. There's always a tension within those of us who sense the power in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and feel charged to do both, are always living a life of ambivalence, of ambiguity, of disharmony, having to make a choice at 6 o'clock Friday evening to go to the Kabbalat Shabbat service or to stay home and read Bertram Russell. God help us. Which strikes you? In other words, Soloveitchik has set up, don't you think it's quite magnificent that he takes these two stories and he's rooted in the stories. He's noting and drawing from elements in these two chapters. This is not just speculative philosophy. This is a reading, possibly an overreading, but certainly a reading of these two chapters. The Bible in chapters 1 and chapters 2 are telling us a very complex story about what it means to be human. Unless you take the alternative that Soloveitchik pushes aside, that these two stories come from two very different hands, and therefore the contradictions just mean that the editor of the Bible didn't know what the heck he was doing. See, Soloveitchik's view is all kinds of tensions, but the biblical author knew exactly, the editor, what he or she was doing, because there was a huge, complex version of what it means to be human right here in these two chapters. Harmonious or not? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Vivian?
Well, I have a question. Can you read Genesis 2 as, can you go so far as to say that Genesis 2 invents religion?
Is then what?
That Genesis 2 invents religion. It raises for the first time the notion of the relationship between God and man. And also, can you call religion a technology? That it isn't our invention of accessing God.
What is our invention? Technology?
Religion.
Religion.
Religion is, what if you were to think of religion as a technology? A one more tool, just like Adam 1's toolbox.
I didn't get your point about it. Are you saying that Genesis 2 invents religion? What does Genesis 1 do?
It invents the life, the world. It talks about, it puts us in context, and then I'm making this up as I go too.
Who's in charge of Genesis 1?
God.
Where is that story in the Bible? Where's Genesis 1? Where do we find it? In the Bible.
Yes.
The Bible's a religious book. God's a religious figure. Don't you think the answer is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 together invent religion?
Yes, but I think it's clearer. It becomes clear in 2 in context of 1.
Okay, so here's a response which rejects your view.
Okay.
It's clearer because you bring to your comment a conventional view of religion. That religion is its study, its introspection, its services, its Sukkot, its bar mitzvahs. It's not studying physics in college. It's not going out and building the Large Hadron Collider so you can discover the Higgs boson. That's not religion. That's science and technology. No, that's religion too. Don't you think that's a plausible reading of Genesis 1 and 2? That when we imitate God's creative gestures over against the world, what's more religious than imitating God? What do you think about that, Vivian?
I think that's right, but I'm just saying if you look at science also, or religion as science, now I'm tangled up. I just think, I've never crossed that notion that religion is, could be a technology, but it seems to open up to me the reasoning or the passion for science being part of religion.
Yeah.
I mean, okay,
Do you agree with that?
yes.
Oh, wow. I thought you were, did you change your mind along
No, I
the?
don't think I changed, I think I came into the, I didn't change my mind, I'm probably not being clear. It's just, pardon?
Yeah, good. No, you're thinking about this. I think it's, yeah.
Well, how do we access God? There are millions of doors here, so in study, in a passion for science, in a passion for literature, in reading the Bible as metaphor, all those things are wrapped up to me as different ways of struggling with what it is.
Right, no, that's right. And do you think finally can we get beyond the struggle to harmony?
Ooh, well, have we?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's the question that
Right,
this
that's where we're
raises.
going, right?
I'm sorry?
We have to live with the struggle.
Yeah. I think Soloveitchik here feels the Bible has a very, very sophisticated view of what it means to be human and is willing to face the incongruities, the tensions. Jeff?
Well, I love this point, and I want to add one possible gloss, which is, if chapter 1 creates religion in the sense of go out and do things, I think chapter 2 adds to it in the personal relationship, just as in Kabbalat Shabbat. It's a very mystical experience.
Yes,
I don't find chapter 1 to be particularly mystical in its commandments.
Yes.
I think chapter 2 gives man in his relation to God a different reason to do things because of the personal relationship. It makes the commandments more intimate, if you will, but it also, I think, allows people to express their religion in ways other than simply going out and dominating the earth. In other words, if we accept your idea that chapter 1 creates religion, I think it does because of chapter 2.
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? I don't think, if Genesis had only chapter 1 and skipped to 3, I don't think chapter 1 would be a complete or adequate definition of religion, at least as I understand it. I don't want to presume to speak for anybody else.
So let me ask you this
Which
question.
I think is harmonizing the two. Excuse me for interrupting you.
So Genesis 1 without Genesis 2 wouldn't create religion. Would Genesis 2 without Genesis 1 create religion?
I'm not sure that it would. I think that the logic of the argument is that they need each other. And
why do they need each other? In a certain way, Soloveitchik will say this in a minute, this is not my own idea. In order to create woman in chapter 2, Adam needs to be put to sleep. Adam needs to engage in an act of self-sacrifice. Adam needs to recognize, Adam 2, his humility. The sleep is not just a part of the narrative. It says something about the necessity for sacrifice. Yes, I like that, right? If I'm everything, and then I'm involved in self-worship, I have to recognize there's something higher than me. I have to sacrifice something of my ego. True. But Genesis 1 calls me to express my ego. And I think this is the key point. It's the obvious point. Genesis 1 is in the Bible. And therefore Genesis 2, though it strikes us it's more intimate, expresses our needs and the possibility of intimacy. I think what Soloveitchik is suggesting, this is what I find very exciting about it, is our dignity also is in our capacity to create and to Solve the question of diphtheria, for crying out loud. But in theory, there's enough food to feed everybody. We have solved that. We just haven't been able to distribute it well enough. And that has to do with politics and things like this. But we have solved the problems of human privation, sanitation. Wow. We are taking our mandate and making life better. That's what God wants. That's what God wants.
Maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to go back to the question I think you posed to us when you took that stop or break. I find more comforting for me that there is intention in terms of creating these two dual images of man in Adam 1 and Adam 2. And I think that it is, so I don't think it's a mistake or accidental. I think there is, as you said, a tension that's created, and that tension is ultimately irreconcilable. But we cannot avoid living with that tension. So both as a species, as well as individuals, we each live somewhere with that, along that, if you will, continuum or that dichotomy. And we, as a species, live with that. So when you talk about this ability to conquer diphtheria,
Ability to...
diphtheria, to eliminate diphtheria, and to end starvation through technology. So we have also, through that technology, wrought the destruction of the world.
Of course.
Whether through atomic bombs or destruction of the climate. So Adam 1 is commanded to do all those things, which, unbridled by Adam 2, leads to the end of humanity.
Yes, and is this a problem?
Well,
For the biblical author?
no.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because we've got just an intimation so far on the limits of our powers. What happens after this story? I mean, Adam and Eve disobey. They get thrown out of paradise. The next thing you know, Eve is giving birth to a son. What does she say? The translation is an evasion. Now, chapter 4, verse 1, the man knew his wife, and she conceived. I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. That is not the Hebrew. The Hebrew is, I have created a child with the Lord. I am like God. In other words, the power that human beings are endowed with can run out of control. Then we have the increase in violence until God says, I made a mistake in creating the universe, so I'm going to destroy it. Things are spinning out of control here. All right, so we got Noah. Thank God for Noah. Bridge to the future. And so destroys everything, starts again. What happens immediately? Noah gets drunk. You can't blame him. He doesn't know about the effect of wine. And he lies there naked. Once you see your parents naked, once you see the exposed humanity in its rawness, it's harder for them to be the teachers of their children. A teacher needs to have some dignity along with humanity. Noah gets drunk. And then we have the Tower of Babel. I mean, powers, humanity, and what does the biblical editor do next? He doesn't spin out all the great things we do. He tells how we've gotten out of control. Something is still missing. What's missing? I'll just say it in 2 words. Abraham and Moses. So I think the Bible recognizes what you're saying. It can spin out of control. In other words, this is the other ambiguity. You give human beings powers. This is our dignity. But also we can abuse those powers. No. We do abuse those powers. That's another part of us. I mean, why are all of these pre-Abraham stories stories of human beings blowing it? Isn't that potent? Here at the beginning in chapters 1 through 3, certainly 1 and 2, endowment, opportunity, glory, grandeur, dignity. The story's not over. Irv.
I've been trying to keep quiet, but I'm troubled by this whole discussion. I think there's too much being read into the plain text here. I don't see these two stories as incommensurate with one another. The first one is about nature, about man, literally about man, how man evolved. The second confronts the issue is, well, once man is here, how does he interact with what is around him? He or she, ladies. And this is it's a logical continuation of the first chapter.
Yeah.
I mean, science is part of it, but the kind of speculation which goes far beyond the words that we've been dealing with is also part of the human situation. I think I better stop. Well, let me push it a little farther.
It's a good challenge. It's a good challenge.
The tree of knowledge will lead to death.
Yep.
The ultimate interpretation of that, if you pursue knowledge enough, you're going to develop tools which will permit you to destroy, not you, mankind. And this is very perceptive of the author.
Absolutely.
To have foreseen this.
Knowledge is ambiguous.
So that's as far as I want to go.
Well, what about the Alaska pipeline? So we need the oil. We got to run the factories. That's wealth. Capitalism creates wealth, and wealth, at least in principle, creates well-being. I mean, that's part of the power of capitalism. It creates wealth, and if you have the sagacity and the generosity to distribute that wealth, then capitalism, yeah, and you need the Alaska pipeline, except it ruins the environment. Okay, so don't do it. Gary?
No, it doesn't.
Well, what's the argument against it?
I don't want to get into this too much in the weeds, but the studies that were done.
I can't hear you.
Studies were done over the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years. There's no environmental impact based on the way it's.
So what's the objection?
Well, that raises a whole other issue here, which I don't really want to get into because it really brings politics.
Okay, all right.
But I'd like to go back because I agree fully with what Irv was saying. I think that chapters 1 and 2 are mirror images to some extent. And I agree with other people's remarks that without chapter 1, chapter 2 would not have been written. And I also think that if I had been the editor in those ancient days, I would have integrated the 2 chapters.
You would have said them both.
I would have integrated them, rather than have 2 separate chapters, because it's been confusing to people and people's, salvation 60-plus page essay is all about trying to separate that confusion, try to make some sense out of that confusion. At least that's the way I view it. I haven't read that essay. I'd like to do that at some point.
So the creation of woman, would you say, and God said, God created male and female. But he also created female out of Adam. I mean, could you say them both?
I don't know exactly how I would have done it. Not very
Or the animals are created first in Genesis 1 and after human beings in chapter 2. The animal kingdom has some independence in chapter 1. Chapter 2, they come to see if they're going to be helpers to human beings. How could you say them both?
Well, I think that we have to assume that since animals were created in chapter 1, we have to assume that they were male and female animals. So the concept of male-female gender differences was already established.
Yeah, but it's just the question of when they were created. You have A created before B in chapter 1 and B created before A in chapter 2. How could you write one story to contain both, since they're contradictions?
Well, I think I would have melded them and eliminated the contradictions.
Okay, all right. So you would have a more harmonious view.
I would have.
Okay, fair enough. I'm sorry?
But I wasn't the editor.
You weren't the editor. Yeah, right. Was the editor a genius or confused?
Pardon me?
Was the editor a genius or confused?
Neither.
I would
Neither. It was
say
human.
that the editor probably had in mind that chapter 1 was already in existence, and it wasn't up to him or her to eliminate that chapter. But they had a different view, and we wanted to put that view into the Tanakh.
It's probably the other way around. Genesis 2 was first, and then the priestly editors in the exile, this is the theory, then, and what a bold stroke. They read the Bible, and so far, it's chapter 2 is chapter 1. And they said, you know what, I'm going to try to get away with something here. I'm going to try to make chapter 1 chapter 2. And I'm going to invent chapter 1. Which probably is what happened. The origin of the two chapters is probably historically intelligible, except, what's the way to say this? I don't know. It reminds me of consonance and dissonance in music. You have stuff rolling along, and then all of a sudden the composer says, "Wait a minute, I can deepen this. I'm gonna move to a remote key." And when the composer does that, you're my God, wow. Schubert does this all the time, doesn't he? All of a sudden you're in a different key, and it wakens you up. So it's not as if that's the issue of deepening. I think Genesis 1 was a political move on the part of the priests who wrote a chapter to show themselves at the acme of the society. After all, the final move is the creation of Shabbat. That serves the priests. So it had a political impulse, we might infer, but whether the priestly editor or authors or editors were aware of it, they created something which to me is monumental. They dared. I think of it as filled with contradiction. Conflict. It's the conflict in the human breast, isn't it? That's how I feel. Harry, you had and then Enid, I'm sorry.
I think that chapters 1 and 2 are absolutely different. In that chapter 1 is all about the creation of the earth. And in the absence of knowledge of how the earth was actually created, they made up a story, which is chapter 1. It was later corrected by the theory of evolution. Chapter 2 and onward is all about modeling human behavior and describing human behavior. story afterwards, you can find logic in it. And people in those days needed models of human behavior, because otherwise they would not be controlled, they would not be guided. And chapter 2 and onwards provides that kind of guidance.
Okay, I think that's a great comment with a big problem. And I think the problem is human beings are created also in chapter 1. And they're not created on the second day, third day, it's just one more element. They're created on the sixth day and told you can control everything in days 1. So human beings are a crucial part of chapter 1 too. I don't think it's just earth in chapter 1, which just happens to have human beings, and chapter 2 focuses on human beings, human behavior, human need. Because chapter 1, human beings are the climax, or at least the A-N-T-E, climax of creation. So they're both dealing with human beings. And chapter 1, I think, as powerfully as chapter 2. I think that's the problem with your theory. In other words, to separate the two chapters in some way or another, I'm not sure it works. So, what do you think about that, Harry? I mean,
it doesn't provide guidance. It doesn't provide behavior norms.
yeah, right. It provides mandate, though. It provides vocation, unqualified. This is true. There's no accompanying the yes. But, it does separate out, without qualification or reserve, our capacity, and we know we have it, to dominate, to control nature. And chapter 1 focuses on that. Enid.
I'd like to raise another incongruity that we have not discussed. In the chapter 2, God gives the no instruction to Adam, and then later on Eve is created. I would like to move that paragraph, chapter 15, and put it after the creation of Adam, so that it would be an instruction to both of them. Whereas in chapter 1, Adam and Eve are created at the same time. Here they're created at a different time, and I think Eve is given a subservient position.
Subordinate role. Yeah. And that's led to a lot of social structure. Just that. There's a wonderful essay by Phyllis Tribble called A Love Story Gone Awry. It's a long investigation of this. And one of her main points is Eve is a much more dominant individual in this story. She gives it to Adam and he eats. He doesn't say to her, well, wait a minute now. So I think her point is that the traditional reading of this is misguided. So it's worth reading. It's in her essay, a collection of essays with the title Something and the Rhetoric of Sexuality. Something and the Rhetoric. It's worth reading because Enid puts your finger on something very important. Of course, what's arresting about it is precisely the tension, if not the contrast, between men and women created together and then one created after. It's as if there are two ways of looking at this, and maybe we're beset by both. I've got a bar mitzvah to conduct. Anybody want? I'll stay if somebody will conduct the bar mitzvah. Wonderful boy. He'll have a good time. Okay. So next week, I think we're not done. I think I'll read a little more of Soloveitchik. This has been a very exciting discussion, actually. because we're wrestling with the phenomena of these two chapters, and it's quite clear it's not obvious how to read them. This is a strong reading, and we love strong readings, don't we? And not only to be convinced, but something to butt up against. And then we're going to go on to a little bit of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and just see some more elements of the human condition. I'll see you next week, if not before. Shabbat Shalom. By the way, if you want to look at the Haftorah portion for today is Genesis 1 in the reading. Look at the book of Isaiah, chapter 42 and 43. Isaiah sees the redemption of the people from Babylonia as another example of God's creative work. Creation is not over at creation.
Did you get my note?
I didn't, Charlotte. When did you send it?
I mailed it Sunday.
Did you? Was it an email?
No, I wrote you a letter.
Oh, you wrote me a letter. Well, I've been out of town for 3 or 4 days, so I will get it tomorrow.
I wanted to explain my bad behavior.
Oh, hardly. Badly. I'll read it and I'll get back to you. Thank you.
I rarely speak unless the answer is a yes or no.
I know, but to that end though, Gary, I mean, as much as I agree with you 100%, there was no subterfuge for everybody knew what he was going to do. But the Trump, of course it was. The focus wasn't on, well, what are we going to get?
She's all we spent 4 years trying to do, one thing after another, they're all, went down the tubes for it. They couldn't do anything because,
Yeah, but still,
they couldn't get anything. It looked all like a roof a year.
I would guess they said way more than half. I'd say by.
This is? Yes. I know who it is.
They cannot, they cannot take.
They can't understand that, believe me, I do. I mean, that's been the case for, what, 60, 70 years?
Yeah, maybe she'll just leave it right here.
Right.
Otherwise,
Maybe going back to Tio.
Listen, I play golf for a few guys.
oh, that's really nice.
One very down the middle, as far as he'll listen and he'll make sense of it. But he's a Democrat, but he's an old time. The other guy is a sponsor for the and he said he's done, he said he doesn't want any problems. So he's done this stuff. Right. He said, I said, Steve, who was my I said, you know, it's particularly sad to me, but it's the way it is.
And
Our fellow brothers and sisters,
but she's so good to her nieces and
and they can't see what's in front of them. And it's really sad, particularly because at the end of the day, it affects me. And I'm not in it. The inflation is already, it's there, go to the grocery store, go to the gas station, it's right in front of me. And wait till they change the tax law. And I don't know what the hell the goal is with sheer power, it's not the veteran. Everybody's worse off for it, everybody. And have what?
But anyway.
Yeah, but they'll be dead by the time.
I didn't mean it, it was not.
Exactly, but they don't care.
We have to do what we have to do.
I was just gonna say, there wasn't really any other option. But then again, last Saturday when I walked out of here, there was a pail of dirty water and they were washing the floor out.
Who I wish well, and we get along fine, we never discuss. But she's way less. Sue's sister. And the left can't do that. They just can't. Because she doesn't pay any attention. She doesn't. And when Hillary was running, and we had a little conversation,
Either take her out for lunch, depending on if we can go
she's
eat outside.
great. I said, do you listen to her? She's telling you, she's anti-Semitic, she's telling you.
We're late on
I'm sure
Sunday.
that there's something wrong. She's telling you flat out, she's against Israel.
But anyway, she said she's out.
And the whole point is, she doesn't care which, a person like Hillary just wants, she doesn't care what the hell the issue is. She wants to be in charge. I mean, if it was a dog catcher, she'd want to be in charge.
But she's
Yeah, I
generous.
agree with you.
Very generous. She's more than generous.
And that's it, that's her only interest, there's a lot of people like that. And what you gotta do is when they're in your face, you gotta not back out.
Well,
You gotta say, no,
when
no, I'm not buying it.
our friend
Now,
was putting
Roger
it together, he
surprised
said
me
these
a
drum
few
heads
weeks
are
ago.
terrible.
It's the only time he ever did this.
So I looked
in
in
his
the
sermon.
basement and I have
I wonder if it's the
drum
same
heads
guy.
for some
Well,
fine.
anyway, I know he's way left, but he's smart when he keeps it
Special drum set.
He comes out about the base.
Since I'm not far from.
And he said, and he's being around us who won't
I
get
think
it.
I'm
I'm
gonna call him
thinking,
up. I know Archwood.
Roger, you might be right.
Let's take the
But
drum over to the store.
20 years from now, maybe being around us will
Couple
be
of drum
right.
heads.
Maybe the harm was